Hello, I'm Steve Muzzy, Senior Manager of Climate Programs at Second Nature. Welcome to the webinar, Analyzing Climate Leadership Network Progress. Before we get started, I want to provide a little context for today's discussion. Next slide. Go back a couple. Right there. No, there we go. Okay, so for many years, the focus of the climate leadership commitments was on growing the number of signatories, bringing attention to the issue of climate change and higher education's responsibility to address it, and taking action on individual campuses. But now with 10 years of implementing climate action strategies, there's an opportunity to reorient the measures of success for the network. So looking at this table, we have the column of Network 1.0 reflecting the commitments for the years 2007 to 2015. And so as we move to Network 2.0, we want to shift focus from growing the number of signatories to analyzing and communicating the performance of individual signatories and the network as a whole. So today's webinar and FOVEA's analysis is a step in this direction. And other steps we have taken for the Network 2.0 in this regard have been the investment in the new reporting platform that was launched last year, 2017, the partnering with UNH and SciMap to align and share data, and continuing to work with greenhouse gas experts like EPA's Green Power Partnership and the Greenhouse Gas Protocol to refine the tracking and communication of renewable energy. So the analysis of the performance is also helping identify progress. And as a quick note, we are working on what we are calling marks of distinction that will be added to individual signatory dashboards to recognize progress and achievements. So as we move through this table, the data analysis is also helping to inform the areas of reductions that signatories can focus on in order to move closer to the goals outlined in climate action plans. And analyzing performance is helping to refine our technical support. Network 2.0 is also looking to expand the work of individual institutions to form more collaborative and cross-institution and cross-sector initiatives. There's an exciting conversation happening in this area right now, and we are looking to announce this at the Climate Leadership Summit in February, so stay tuned there. And finally, Network 2.0 is looking to engage senior leadership more in their commitments. An example is Second Nature's partnership with the Advanced Energy Economy. They aim to support clean, secure, and affordable energy, and we see interest and opportunity for signatory senior leadership to engage in this effort. And we actually had a webinar with the Advanced Energy Economy last week that I highly suggest checking out. Next slide. So just a quick outline of today's discussion, and there's an amendment here on this list, but so we did a quick overview, context. I'm going to introduce our speakers and provide and share some reminders that are pertinent to the network. So then I'm going to turn it over to FOVEA. They're going to overview their data analysis, and they're going to also include next steps for carbon reduction. So that's the amendment here. And then they'll turn it over to the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and we'll get a campus perspective, and then we'll save a lot of time, hopefully, for questions and answers. And just a reminder, please submit your questions as we're presenting at any time using the little control panel for your GoToWebinar control panel. Next slide. So again, I'm Steve Muzzy, Senior Manager of Climate Programs at Second Nature. We're joined by Kate Nelson, Chief Sustainability Officer at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and she is joined by her colleague, John Gardner, who is the Program and Policy Analysis at the Office of Sustainability. Next slide. And we have Rob McKenna and Dave Karlsgodt, principals at FOVEA, who will be giving the bulk of the presentation. Next slide. And as always, we need to and want to thank our sponsors who support us and the signatories in climate advancing climate action. And as you can see, FOVEA is a corporate partner, and our partnership with FOVEA is focused in 3 areas. So first, FOVEA is helping us analyze, visualize, and communicate or understand the Climate Leadership Network data. Second, we hope this analysis is going to inform reporting platform enhancements and reporting processes, with special attention being paid to the Climate Action Plan report. And third, FOVEA is providing technical support for us on the reporting platform, and specifically, they're helping us with the data sharing with SciMav. And so FOVEA has years of experience working with higher ed on climate action planning. Their services provide facilitation, data visualization, and scenario planning to maximize deep greenhouse gas reductions and return on investment. Next slide. So I'm going to go through these reminders pretty quickly. We are going to be sending a more comprehensive note to the network and all the implementation liaisons next week. But again, reporting, next round of reporting is coming up. So last year we launched the new reporting platform and we changed the reporting due date. So again, you can report anytime between January 1st and May 1st. No extensions need to be requested. If you need more time beyond May 1st, please reach out to us and we'll work with you on getting that report in. Next slide. So quickly, just what to do. Carbon commitment signatories are due to submit another annual progress evaluation. Again, that is mostly greenhouse gas report with some qualitative feedback on your progress to add climate action to your curriculum, research, and community engagement. Next slide. Climate commitment signatories, those that are doing resilience and carbon, you have due an annual progress evaluation and your resilience assessment. Next slide. And then resilience commitment signatories are due to submit a resilience assessment for the next reporting due date. Next slide. Next reminder, just we partnered with the University of New Hampshire on their sustainability indicator management and analysis platform, otherwise known as SciMap, and that these platforms will be talking to each other and sharing greenhouse gas outputs from SciMap to our platform. Next slide. And finally, just want to give a reminder that our 2018 Higher Ed Climate Leadership Summit is happening in February in Tempe, Arizona. This has been a collaborative or a co-developed summit with the Intentional Endowments Network. We have Paul Hawken and Janet Napolitano confirmed as speakers, along with many others. We are very excited about the summit and encourage folks to attend if they can, so please check that out. And then finally, before I turn it over to Dave and Rob at FOVEA, just kind of a note on the data today on this presentation. So the intent of the analysis is to show what the data submitted is telling us. It's an objective and transparent depiction of the data, and any individual campus examples that are shown, they are not intended to reflect negatively on campus efforts. We just want to have an open and transparent conversation. So with that, let's turn it over to Dave and Rob and have a look at the analysis.
Great, thanks, Steve. Give us a second while we share the screens here. All right, can you guys see the screen okay?
Yeah.
Great, well, thanks for that introduction. My name is Dave Karlsgodt. I am a principal. I will be joined in a second by my partner, Rob McKenna, and I also wanted to give a special shout out to our data analyst, Brendan, who also put a lot of work into this effort that we're about to show you. So a picture of me, just so you know what I look like. We were asked basically to look at a couple of key things. So what can we learn from the 12 years of annual emissions reporting data that's been collected by all of you? Kind of looking at how aggressive are the goals that you've all stated, and how are you doing as a network to meet them, or how are we doing as a network to meet them, I should say. We're also going to look a little bit at the major sources of where are the emissions coming from, and then what can we do to focus our efforts to address those. And then this question around who's making the most progress, and we'll get into answering that question a number of different ways. So first of all, I want to go through a few slides that'll just give you a brief overview of the methodology we used to come up with this analysis. So first of all, I'll just start with different regions. I'll be showing some slides showing the regions. So I'll just give you a second to kind of orient yourself to how the regions are defined. So we first of all just wanted to know where are the greenhouse gas reports coming from. So what parts of the country? And so key things here, you'll notice there are certainly a lot more schools in terms of number of institutions in the Northeast and then lots of public schools in the Southwest, where some of the other regions of the country aren't, don't have as many schools represented. So you'll see that kind of play out throughout the data as we go through this. We also looked at where are the emissions coming from different regions of the country. And it was interesting to us that, the Midwest, especially the public schools in the Midwest, still make up a bulk of the emissions. That has a lot to do with their source of electricity and use of coal. But we are going to talk a little bit more as I go through some of these summary slides. I wanted to back up a second. As many of you know, not every school is submitting a report every year, and certainly not going back to 1990 or anything like that. We're showing the University of Vermont. They actually have been submitting pretty regularly for quite a long time. But even as rigorous as they have been, there are still years or gaps in the data where they haven't submitted, for example. And so the way we've been addressing this in our analysis will be, we're just taking data from previous years and then pulling it forward to the future years. So when I'm showing these reports and we're showing totals for a given year, we're using techniques like this to fill in gaps where there were jumps or gaps in the data. So Rob will go through a series of slides where he gives some other specific examples from different schools. And then later, Kate will talk about some of the work they're doing in Wisconsin. But you'll see these charts. I'll just explain this briefly just so you know what you're looking at. So the little smokestacks here are reports that were reported in a given year. We are using a baseline as reported by each school. And then we're showing looking at both gross and net emissions that you all reported. So we'll come back to this slide, but I just wanted to start with that just so you have some context. In some of the other schools, and I'm not going to call out the specific schools, but there were cases or challenges we ran into where there were cases where schools maybe had only submitted 3 reports and maybe their last report was a few years old. And in cases like that, we're assuming that whatever they last reported is still where they are. That's probably not true, but that's that was the assumption we made. And then there are some schools, that maybe have only reported once, and it's really hard to show progress if you've only submitted 1 report. So in those cases, we're not, and I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. And there are other cases where maybe the most recent report, there may have been gaps, but we're using data from the most recent school. So with that in mind, one of the challenges of looking at all this inventory data and trying to make some sense of it was, how do we even visualize it? Because of all those data gaps and other things, we tried a couple of different techniques to tease some insights out of it. So this first set of slides I'll show you is we took all the institutions that were reporting, and so we just ordered them from smallest emissions reported to largest emissions reported, and then we're showing them through time. So I'm just going to flip between a couple of years here. So hopefully this is coming through with a little slight delay. So in 2010, the schools range from fairly low emissions for an individual school all the way up to 700,000 tons for one school. But you can see through time, more schools are starting to report, so we had more reports to look at, and there's been some motion downwards visually. So another way we looked at this information, we looked at everyone that's ever reported. So this would even include people that maybe are no longer active members of the network, but we totaled all of their baseline emissions to try to come up with what is an aggregate inventory for the entire network. So kind of like a giant footprint for all the schools combined. And so what we looked at here is, so we were able to total that number. So this is different years for different schools, but we can come up with a total number of almost 30 million metric tons. And then we have the goals, and we have a collective goal number. And so you can see it starts getting bigger in these early years as more schools came online. But going forward, we're still totaling the goals up for all these schools. And we can kind of see a collective goal for the network as stated today. And then this green line here will show you what's the sum of all of the reported emissions to this date. So a couple of key things I wanted to highlight here. But first of all, this major increase here is as much a methodology issue as it is actual reported emissions. Since more schools are coming online, that increase isn't necessarily an increase in the schools. And then more importantly, we do show that of all the schools that have ever reported, including ones that may not be active members anymore, there still has been some drop in emissions relative to where everyone started. So at least we've made some progress so far. And if we did look at just those that are still in the network, that would drop a little bit further. And then there's also this interesting, we've been calling it the mid-century cliff, when a lot of schools have a 2050 target. So there's this sort of giant drop that we're expecting as a network when you total up all the goals. And then there are even some schools that have goals that go way out as far as 2099. So, and we kind of assumed everybody has to hit carbon neutrality by 2100 when we were doing this analysis, even if they hadn't specifically stated that. But I'd say most schools have a goal that's earlier on. But when you total all those numbers up, we did, just how much carbon would that represent? So it's about 1/10 of one estimate of what the remaining carbon budget is. That's kind of a squishy number. 1/10 of a percent, I should say, which is, I don't know, I'm not sure how to feel about that number. I guess it's interesting. We certainly hope as higher ed institutions, we're really pushing the envelope so that we're not taking advantage of that whole budget. But we're still projecting to emit this many metric tons as a network according to our current goals. So there's probably room for improvement in making our goals more aggressive as time goes on. So this would be all institutions if you just look at public institutions versus private institutions. And again, I'll caveat this includes schools that maybe have dropped from the network. Then you'll see that the public institutions as a group make up the majority of the emissions, and then the private institutions are down there below. So if you add them all up, they add up together. And this is important, just the scale of the public institutions versus the private institutions, which will come into play later. So we've looked at this by region, and I'm not going to go through all these slides, but we'll include this in the slide deck we'll make available to you after this webinar is complete. So I'll just kind of click through a couple of these. There are definitely differences in region in terms of scale and rates and performance. So another way we looked at this was just trying to get a sense of all the schools that are in this database, how many of them are showing progress relative to their baseline. So just more on a number of schools perspective. So this chart basically shows us that about 59% of all institutions have shown some reduction. So if you take their baseline number and then a report after their baseline, that number has gone down on a gross basis. That maybe not be all that impressive, but it's important to note that that 14% of institutions have only actually submitted one report. So we don't know if they've made any progress or not because they've only submitted one time. So that any school that only has one report, that would be room for improvement, obviously. And then there were 27% of schools that actually reported an increase relative to their baseline. So, and I would note, this is, somewhat alarming if you're in a network and you're trying to reduce emissions. This is not what you want to see. However, I would also note that, especially out here on the edges, and we'll talk about this more with Rob in a second, both the major increases and the major reductions, for the most part, were more data anomalies or reporting methodology errors rather than actual increases or reductions. I think that if you see schools that have numbers that need correction in their reports, that a lot of this messiness would go away on the edges here. We tried to look at this in different ways. Say, if we look at it based on square feet or relative to how many emissions they started with, does it look much different? It basically told the same story. So I'll include these in our slides. We also looked at how has the network been doing in terms of carbon intensity, and so reducing carbon intensity through time. Generally speaking, on average, both public and private institutions have made some reductions in carbon intensity. So on a metric tons per 1,000 square feet basis, publics have dropped a fair amount. But nothing too super dramatic, but we're at least, as we're growing at a lower carbon intensity. However, I would also note that this group of schools as a group, if we had to guess, has probably added a couple of extra campuses worth of gross square feet as a group. So, this helps make the problem less bad, but it by itself is not the solution. This, I guess we've been calling it the Neapolitan ice cream chart or something like that. So we're looking at percentage of scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions of all institutions. So first of all, I guess at first blush, it's roughly a third, although scope 2 emissions, which comes primarily from purchased electricity, is a little bit larger than the other two scopes. When you break it down by subscope, so looking at individual components, purchased electricity is definitely the largest component of the network's emissions, followed by on-site fuel, which would include things such as coal, natural gas, and other combustibles. And then commuting is the third category, and then followed by air travel, solid waste, fleet, and then a whole bunch of other small things that we've totaled up into other. This is interesting in that if you are going to focus on, we've been calling these sort of the big levers. So if you're going to focus on reducing your emissions, you certainly want to focus first and foremost on your purchased electricity, obviously depending on where you are in your current situation, but where there's a lot of energy sometimes spent on things like solid waste and fleet, when at least according to the network on average, these are not major contributors to higher ed's carbon footprint. That may be different for society at large, but at least for higher ed. So if we look at it a different way, same numbers, and we just break it down by which of these emissions are energy-related emissions and which of them are non-energy related emissions, or at least non-direct energy-related emissions, you get roughly the 70% mark for schools as on average. So these are things, so if you can do something about your purchased electricity, your on-site fuel, as well as your mobile fuels, that represents about 70%. Well, things like commuting obviously require energy as well. They're not in your direct control. However, if you are looking at different types of institution, this picture looks quite different. So if you're a doctoral granting institution, so a major university with lots of science buildings and medical centers, your footprint looks, a little bit more like the average I was showing a second ago. However, if you're a school that has a fair amount of commuting, like an associate's college, the group of associate colleges looks quite different, where scope 3 commuting is by far your largest component. And on-site fuel is quite small. So you're going to have a different set of strategies than a large public institution might. And same with the energy related, the same charts broken down for associates colleges. There's differences by region for sure, although not super dramatic. I think the one that jumps out to me is the Northeast has, a large heating load, and their on-site fuels is quite large relative to the other areas. Public and private institutions have a little bit different. I won't go through these, but these will be included in the slides. And then finally, we looked into purchased renewable energy credits and offsets. We've heard from a lot of schools, or a sort of a major assumption, that schools that are making progress are most likely doing it through RECs and offsets. And so we dove into the data to see if that's actually true. And at least according to the data that's been reported to Second Nature, and that's it didn't really bear out that well. While there certainly are examples of individual schools that are purchasing lots of RECs and offsets, which Rob's going to talk about in a second, as a group, and compared to the total amount of electricity purchased, it only represented about 2 to 5%. And we have this range because we only had electricity reported data for a subset of the overall schools, but using some estimates, that's kind of the range that we're in. And then for offsets, it's only about 1%. So far, while I think a lot of people think about RECs and offsets as being a major portion of their future strategy, it certainly has not been a realized strategy so far. That said, we did have a long discussion yesterday with Second Nature, and there were instances in the database where we found some schools actually had negative offsets, which takes you a second to get your head around. But basically that means they had done a project to reduce their emissions, and instead of retaining those reductions themselves and claiming those reductions, they sold the offset credit to someone else. So they got the money instead of the credit for reducing emissions. And while certainly as a network, if we all did that, that wouldn't work. We wouldn't reduce our emissions at all, at least according to the accounting rules. However, it's an interesting strategy for a lot of universities right now, because if you're not actually regulated to get rid of these emissions, you might benefit more by taking the money and reinvesting it into your campus in another way and locking in some of those emissions for the long haul. So there are certainly lots of different strategies that one can pursue around using offsets and RECs. And I'll speak for Second Nature for a second and say that I know that there's a very big willingness to continue talking about how to effectively use these and to understand how they're structured and how they're supposed to be used. Because I think that's something that anybody in this industry, it takes a while to get your head around how these things work. So just in summary of this section, there's been some progress for sure. We've got a long road ahead of us, and even 12 years of data when you're looking out, for the next 100 years is not a lot of information. So it's a little too early to tell how we're doing, although we have a lot of work in front of us. Many of us are doing, making progress. That's great. There's certainly some schools that, they may not be making progress, but it's good that they're reporting, and at least we know that we can do something about it. Emissions intensities are reducing, which is good. Remember these, kind of key areas. So depending on the type of institution, you're going to want to focus on your biggest problems first, or those things that you have control over. And then finally, be looking for these different strategies. There's a lot of unrealized potential in some of the more advanced strategies that are out there. But I'm going to turn it over now to my partner, Rob McKenna, and he's going to talk a little bit about who is reporting neutrality. We do have a few schools in the network that are reporting that they've achieved neutrality. And then he's also going to talk about who are some of the biggest reductions on an absolute basis, and talk about, are these great models for everyone else, or are there some other things going on there? And then we'll also show you some of the biggest emitters, some of the big schools, and so how it's working for them. So Rob, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dave. So yeah, let's start out with Middlebury College, and this is one that I think a lot of people in the network are aware of, and some of the great things that have been taking place there. And by the way, let me preface this by saying we've not spoken to these institutions. We're simply just pulling information from the database and reporting what we see in there and making inferences from there. So as you can see from here, they've been a consistent reporter. Every couple of years they're submitting reports, and from a scope 1 basis of the way that this is organized, on the left side here we have what Dave showed us earlier about the reductions that they're making, how often they're reporting their emissions from a net perspective and from a gross perspective. On the right side, we have detail on the breakdown of scope 1, 2, 3 emissions, and then the sub emissions, at least the major contributors underneath that. And you can see from a scope 1 perspective, they've been making great progress. And Dave, if you actually just flip to the next to highlight the biogenic portion, you can see that a significant portion of that has come from the on-site combustion of a biogenic source that has been reported. Looks like they've not continued to report that, but it's in there. And have had to have a bit of increases in the scope 2 side of things, but have continued to progress. And then you can see that they had this aggressive goal of reaching neutrality by 2016, and as reported in 2017, they reached that goal. And you can see that in that specific year, it was carbon offsets that was employed to take them from their gross reductions of more than, well, almost 60% gross reductions to zero in that time frame. And in the interim, you can see that some renewable energy credits were used. The next example is Colby College. And here's a situation where this is a school that certainly has made great reductions. And you can see that they also had an aggressive goal of reaching neutrality by 2013. And in their most recent two reports have shown that they used a mix of carbon offsets and renewable energy credits in order to reach that goal. One thing that I want to point out, just from the opportunity that each of the schools have to go back and retrospectively look at all the information that's reported to see if there's an opportunity to clean up the history. If you look at the scope 2 emissions, Dave, if you could just hover your mouse over that, you can see that historically scope 2 emissions were not reported, and then with the 2014 report, that all of a sudden shows up. And it'd be interesting if, again, I haven't spoken to them, so I don't know the specifics here, but if they were to go back and retrospectively show scope 2 emissions, they may have been not reporting that because they may have had wrecks or some other element in there. But if they were to report that historically, they would actually show a much greater reduction from a gross perspective. Currently, they're showing 94.7% of their baseline, but if they were to adjust, probably a much larger number on a gross basis. And of course, they've been making the investments in the renewable energy credits and offsets. The short of it is, they're making great progress, and then also augmenting with the RECs and the offsets. The next college is Green Mountain College, and just again highlighting here, they've reduced almost 30% on a gross basis, and then their goal was neutrality by 2015. And again, they've been using carbon offsets to reach those goals. So while Dave talked about earlier, the RECs and the offsets are being used for a small percentage of the purchase of electricity and overall emissions, those that are reaching or reporting neutrality on a net basis have used those consistently in order to reach their objectives. The next, so that's a summary of kind of those that have been reaching neutrality from a net perspective. The next section here just talks about the schools that are showing the greatest gross reductions. And the main point here is, notice I've got model schools with a question mark. Hopefully these are model schools, and I removed the school names here just so we don't have to focus on who they were. They're all in the database. You can go find them if you want to. But the key here is that if you look at, for example, School 2, the Scope 1 emissions, they've reduced it by half. That may be real. The Scope 2 emissions, they've reduced almost 100%, and Scope 3 emissions have been reduced by about 60%. So you look at that school and you think, okay, if these are real reductions, let's all learn from this school what's happening. My fear is that it may be reporting anomalies, maybe inconsistencies in how they've tracked things over time, and that's an opportunity to clean up the system. And Second Nature has continued to highlight that willingness to engage with anyone that wants to go through and try to clean up and the reporting of information. School 5 is another example. If you look at the Scope 2 emissions, all of a sudden with the most recent report, they went to 0. So those are some of the data anomalies that are in there. And again, if that's real, that may be purchase of RECs, that may be renewable energy that they've pulled on, but we just need to make sure that it's consistent so the overall quality of the information in this reporting system can increase, so that we can then learn from each other and understand how to help each other accelerate toward the real solution of greenhouse gas mitigation. So then the next section, we'll just talk briefly about some of these large schools. And these are important because if you look at the left axis here, we've got almost 700,000 metric tons for the Ohio State University. Well, that's equivalent to a big number of the smaller schools. And if you look at what they've been doing historically, they've been consistent reporters, but have kind of been hovering around their baseline. And you notice that for the last couple of years, they haven't reported. Part of that is, I assume, because they've been going through a major transition on the ownership of their energy infrastructure on campus. And so it'll be interesting to see once that all settles and they start reporting again, hopefully they've made some reductions associated with that. But they have been purchasing a few RECs in the meantime. The next example is the University of Minnesota, Twin Cities. And this is interesting to see. And again, look at the Scope 1 and Scope 2 emissions. Looks like real reductions. And again, I haven't spoken to them, but the assumption here is that they've been making real investments in energy conservation and supply efficiency, things on campus to help them make real reductions. And they have not employed renewable energy credits or offsets according to what they've reported. The next example is the University of Illinois at Urbana Champaign. And you notice here quite a large reduction, about 150,000 metric tons on their Scope 1 emissions. And that reduction comes from shifting from coal to more gas-based generation. And they're continuing to also evaluate biomass and other types of biogenic sources that they could have on campus. So they've been consistent reporters in trying to make a big increase a big impact on their mitigations. And you can see that they've, again, reduced more than 100,000 metric tons. So on just an absolute metric ton basis, big impact for these schools. Next school is the Arizona State University. again, they've been making reductions, but interestingly here, a lot of their reduction has been taking place on the scope 3 side of things. And those of you that have evaluated Arizona State, there may be Arizona State people on the call, it'd be interesting to understand how they've done that and what are some of the ways that they've been able to make those impact on the scope 3 side of things, given that that's such a big part of what the network in general needs to deal with. Also, it's interesting to note that their scope 2 emissions have kind of stayed flat, and even though they have one of the largest PV installations on a campus across the country, they've chosen to not retain any of those renewable energy credits. And so they're reporting correctly that they have not made any reductions on their scope 2 or modest reductions on their scope 2 because they're not retaining those attributes. And then the final school here is the University of Missouri-Columbia, and just highlight here that they've made a huge reduction, more than 100,000 metric tons on the scope 1 side of things. Again, a transition from coal, not just to gas, but to a biomass that was a waste residue from a local manufacturing plant. And you can see the yellow area here shows where they would have been if they wouldn't have been using that biogenic resource. So in real terms, the top of the yellow area shows in real terms they are making reductions with energy conservation and other things on campus, but then also adding in the biogenic sources, they've been able to reduce almost approaching half. And they have plans for the future to continue to take that down significantly. So summary here is that there's a lot of great information in this database, a lot we can learn from each other, and we can pull out of here some insights. And if we can all increase the quality of the submissions, there's even more that we can learn from each other and how to help each other continue to progress towards the goals here. Dave, I think that's it.
Great, and I have questions, but we're not going to do questions right now, but I did want to say, if anybody does have questions, please do feel free to reach out to us, especially if we spoke to one of the schools and we spoke incorrectly, we apologize. And I also did want to mention that as part of our partnership with Second Nature, we'll be working with, as kind of a liaison with UNH to get data from the SciMap system into Second Nature to make reporting a little easier. We are also working on developing some simple carbon calculator spreadsheets to replace the void left by the Clean Air Cool Planet calculator. And our goal there would be to create an open source spreadsheet-based reporting tool or carbon inventory tool targeted for more of the simple case. So if you have a pretty complicated inventory to track, that SciMap would be a great tool for you. But if you're just getting started and just trying to get your head around this reporting process, this carbon calculator may be a good option for you as well. And please reach out to us if you're interested in getting involved with that. It's a free tool. It's something we're putting out to the network, not something we're going to ever sell or make money on. It's something we're looking for collaborators on. So with that, we did do the same chart for the University of Milwaukee, or Wisconsin-Milwaukee, and we warned Kate we were going to show this, but she hasn't seen this yet. So we'll turn it over to her.
Thanks, Dave.
And I've changed the presenter, I think. Let's see if it works.
Not yet.
Let's see. There you go.
Can you all see my screen?
Not yet. Yes.
Okay, great. Well, thanks for having us on. I am Kate Nelson, the Chief Sustainability Officer here, and I am joined by my right hand, John Gardner, who does a lot of the input to our data and our reporting. So what you're looking at here is a view of our campus. We are just north of downtown, about 6 blocks from Lake Michigan. I'm leaving this photo up here for a second so that you can see that proximity. Not showing off the green roof on the library there, but what I actually want to point out on the right hand, down below, those red buildings is an 800,000 square foot, very inefficient hospital that I'm going to talk about later on in the presentation. And so here we are a Research One institution. We also have an access mission. And it's interesting, as you'll see, we're kind of between that doctoral research profile and actually that community college profile that you guys looked at in terms of where our scopes lie, because we are indeed a very heavy commuter campus, even though that's not a term we like to use around here. As of today, we have about 26,000 students. Just a few years ago, we had 30,000 students. We are approximately 7 million square feet. So it was our addition of the hospital that became a complicated factor in the very aggressive emission reductions that we were going through performance contracting. Up in the right-hand corner is a picture of our heat plant that is surrounded by one of our largest stormwater projects. That has been one of the most efficient natural gas heat plants in the state for a very long time. And so we have to give due to some incredible folks in our history here who really took conservation seriously from the on-site emissions perspective before sustainability was even a term we used here. In addition to the buildings that we have built over the last few years, most of them have been LEED. We've actually done very little to decommission as well to counteract that. There's just one, it was a small school that acted as our children's center. That's the only construction that was decommissioned. We have had an office here since 2008. I've been here 10 years. But something very interesting, it was, again, an honor to be invited here today. We did not sign the president's climate commitment until this year. While we had many signatories around the UW system, of which there's many four-year institutions that did sign on, actually UW River Falls was one of the first to test the commitment and the STARS program. We held out, which you'll hear about here. Here is just a glimpse. This doesn't show you over time, but just to reflect back on what Dave and Rob were saying. Our number one thing is purchased electricity, but then depending on how you want to look at good metrics, the commuting is a huge factor for us as we are in the middle of the city, but we'll talk about that later. And then of course our on-campus stationary. So those levers, as you were discussing, are very similar, I think, across the board of what we all need to be addressing. So you're familiar with this type of graph coming right out of Second Nature. This is just a glimpse as to our emission reductions, and I'm going to go into a little more depth with a short amount of time as to how we achieve that. Something that we're always on very cognizant of is that the reporting, the data that you require to get that commuting data has errors in it as you extrapolate over the campus. And we are very rigorous with our survey, working with the professor here as well to do that, and other institutions. But we're always the first to say that there's always room for error in that part of your emissions reporting.
Yeah, and I would say you can see some of the scope 1 emissions and the difference between the net and the gross. And that comes from statewide purchasing of renewable energy and energy credits through 4 big contracts. But for the years that don't have it, those were years that we actually just didn't get data from the state. So we might have had reporting on those, but without that verification, we did not want to include it.
And so now you can see what was until 2013 a very beautiful chart of our energy reductions and weather corrected. So you love that big slope going down. This, of course, is all of our on-site and purchased energy, electricity. And I will talk about how we met that. But now we're at this point where there's blips on the end that I'm very concerned about. We've been struggling over the past few years to know exactly how we're going to take it on as a very resource restricted campus. I know the state of Wisconsin has been in the news with our budget cuts and so forth, so I won't go into that. And so the aggressive measures that we took on early on when I started was performance contracting. We had a performance contract in ESCO with Honeywell, but we remained a Johnson Controls campus, so we decided not to put the fox in charge of the hen house, which proved very effective. For us, we were able to get pricing and project management under control that way. We took on about 1 million square feet at a time through 5 phases. the first 2 phases, the first 2 million square feet, we were able to do digital controls. Our structure allowed us at that time to bundle our ECMs, our energy conservation measures, so that we could put high return on investment in the same bundle as a low return on investment to get a magical 16.07 year payback that we were looking for. The campus had a lot of control over the project versus state project management, which was different for us. But really the 75% of our savings came from variable air volume. And then we were able to combine that, of course, with lighting projects. It's fascinating to see the difference back then of what T8s did for us compared to T12s, and now we're on to indoor LED lighting and new fixtures, new lumens, all that kind of thing. But we very much standardized things across our campus. It wasn't so much with a policy, it was with a standardization and building an understanding with all the trades and anyone who impacted our campus as to what our standards were. Of course, there was simple things like building envelope that were taken care of, but also PC power management was a big part of that project, and not the smoothest of alignments because that's touching someone's personal computer, but we were also able to implement that. And that's where that major drop in scope 1 and scope 2 emissions comes from. So very briefly, other things related to that. Early on, we were able to be very aggressive with renewable energy. That was a combination of my efforts in the performance contracting as well as research on our campus. Many of our professors get Department of Energy grants, and we actually have studies going forward for microgrid. That was how we got our first wind turbine. It's not as large as we would like, but still pretty nice to see a wind turbine in the middle of an urban campus. That kind of slowed down under the Walker administration and the loss of grants from our local utility, which has been a whole nother story. We're in a regulated state. But reflecting a little bit on the active transportation planning. So I will be the first to say it was not greenhouse gas emissions that drove the conversation. It was much more of the frustration of a parking budget and being able to change the conversation from how do you park on campus to how do you get to campus. And for the last 5 years, myself and many others have worked very aggressively on bringing new ideas to the table and being able to change the conversation. A lot of it now revolves around health and access, and that really helps change the conversation greatly. To contribute to that, we were very aggressively exploring early stages of the bike share program in Milwaukee. And now 6 of those, for 2.5 years now, we've had 6 stations on the campus or connected to our residence halls. And that is connected to 70+ other bike share stations around the city. We actually implemented a road diet. So a lot of this has to do with a very different conversation with your city, because it's their streets that run through our campus. We don't own the streets. So that was a very aggressive part of our work is that collaboration. We were actually able to remove parking from the streets, put in bike lanes, repave, make things a lot safer and open, and it's very well received. Probably the biggest thing is that there's been a major reduction in how much the student segregated fees supported parking structures. And it's gone down significantly over the years, and they just voted to actually eliminate any subsidies to parking. They're continuing their support of the bus pass and other systems, but there will be absolutely zero student segregated fee funding towards the parking structures. And the students were paying as well, but now they're going to have to be paying even more. And we're in a very dense, constricted area, and they were able to make that move. And then, like I said, it's really become a bigger discussion about safe streets and working at a bigger, broader level with our city and county. So just some of those impacts real quickly. We have seen $17 million of avoided costs in our energy budget. Probably the biggest thing is that by starting where we did, we were able to build the campus buy-in. It was actually by doing the work, not by signing, that we were able to build this buy-in, which has led to bigger conversations that we've never had before. And we can always reflect back and say, you know, when the Office of Sustainability is asking for something, you know, we're standing on very firm ground of what we've brought to the campus so far. Not to mention, I have to say how many folks in facilities help do that as well. A bigger thing for us these days, since we're physically situated in the School of Architecture and Urban Planning, is how much this effort has led to campus curriculum and assessments. We are an official lead lab, although a little bit in a hiatus on that, but really speaks to how much we're able to engage the students in economics and business, architecture, engineering, around these things, and we can use the data that we've put together to do that. And then our most recent thing is that because of those major emission reductions, we qualify for the C2P2 program. So with that, we did become a signatory on Valentine's Day. That is our photo there, their Chancellor in the center, Chancellor Money. We became a signatory. Really, the catalytic thing for us was that we're already doing it. Why not stand up and finally say that we're a leader? And at the same time, we were able to enter the C2P2 program. We now have third-party verification on that. And as those credits sell on the open market, we're one of those schools who's selling them so that we can put more dollars towards future projects. We're focused on scope 1, essentially. Another thing is that while we do have so many other great signatories around our state, we're able to help lead that effort. And actually, it's been my vice chancellor who has been leading a conversation to renew our energy policy in the state system around accounting, efficiency, and renewables. And then we only look at it as a way to further engage our curriculum. A lot of those students in that photo were part of our climate action planning last spring. And so we're actually doing our planning through their lens and using the best of our graduates in urban planning to further our climate action. And I will say for us, resiliency is a very important piece to our campus. The carbon does tend to reside a little bit outside of what our faculty, staff, and students have control over because we're a state school, but the resiliency thing is big for us. So,
and a key point, as you saw in that graph of the energy and the little blip at the end of our performance contracting, we weren't able to include all the energy conservation measures bundled, and so there are still buildings on campus that we've been trying to put efforts into to get that sort of performance back in check. And so we're hoping that some of the C2P2 money will go towards those things. That's in tandem with the more scope 2 focused UW system goals. I would say they tend to be more focused on the electricity side of things, though there are backup coal systems that are going to be focused on first. A lot of the discussions that we've had in our area have centered around our scope 2 emissions and ways that we can partner with local municipalities and our other universities that are in the region to really try to push for our local utility to source more renewables, as well as to give us the regulatory flexibility to find some interesting ways to go about doing that on campus.
Yeah, so that's all I have. I'll turn this back over to Steve.
Nice, thanks, Kate and John. A really inspiring story of your efforts to get to where you're at today. And I just want to kind of make a point and then ask for you to kind of elaborate on it. But it seems like such a long-standing office, consistency with the leadership at that Office of Sustainability, the efforts you've undertaken, and the trust that you've built with your campus in order to get to signing the climate commitment. But I also want to talk about the partnership that you have with the city, and you signed the climate commitment, and you touched on the resiliency aspect. But I'm just really blown away by how much work you've done to build the trust with your campus, to include the city. And if you can just touch upon or share a little bit about your relationship with the city of Milwaukee.
Sure. You know, it was shocking to me that we didn't have a better relationship with the city when I started. I clearly remember learning how we did not have conversations with Department of Public Works. It was alarming. I wasn't really allowed to like touch the parking issue right away, but the students, I was always sort of feeling out the pulse of the students. I'd actually say sort of secretly. And quite frankly, we were working on the performance contracting, so it came secondary. But there was this expression of, hey, we should have more bike racks, and no one knew how many we had. And I just took the opening to say, well, I actually know how much we have, and this is perhaps what we could do. You know, and I treaded lightly, and that led into getting some folks around, and we call ourselves the BAT Force, the Bicycle Advisory Task Force, and that created more and more buy-in. And so actually plans fed into more and more plans. And with that, with the city, we had this opportunity to redo the street, but I left it to our leadership to have those conversations. And when it came back very weak of what we had intended, the plans were literally sitting on my desk with some fellow staff members, and we played good cop, bad cop with the city, and with some very quick change orders, we were able to change the street. We could have done more, I think, but we're actually considering shutting the street down and turning it into a pedestrian walkway even, and it's one of the main strips of our campus. So that kind of cracked things open, was like, okay, if there's a void here and I'm ready to fill it. And with that, there was some early on folks in bike advocacy that started to recognize what we were doing. We were brought to the table actually under an effort called Path to Platinum. That's a pathway to make Milwaukee a platinum level city. And so I've been a core team member of that Safe Streets discussion, and it revolves around health and prosperity as a means to get the entire city to be bike friendly, which has led into larger trails networks that are here working. It just keeps evolving, and John and I stay very closely tied to the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District efforts with resiliency, with the city's Safe Streets efforts, and it's almost become like a third of my job is to integrate what we're doing with the community.
That's great. Thank you. So we do have one question from the audience, and it's around air travel and scope 3, and just clarification on that the criteria for that source of emissions. So air travel for us is any air travel paid for by the institution. That's what's supposed to be reported under scope 3 air travel for the carbon and climate commitments. So clarifying that. Are there any comments from the panelists with a couple minutes left here?
This is David. I just wanted to say, Kate, thanks for that presentation. That was fun to see kind of how you guys have gotten there. And I think, you know, in our work, we see that a lot too. It's not, there's not like one magic thing that happens. It's really this long, consistent, you know, taking on of all these issues, and it, you know, over time you start seeing real progress. And that's part of, you know, when Rob was showing some of those slides, and you see these massive drops without any, you know, we don't have any of the backstory. So to us, we can kind of look at that data and sometimes not trust it as much, but it's always great to see, you know, somebody who's really, you can tell you the story, can tell you exactly why, and tell you exactly where they're how they're working, and having the right level of measurement, and et cetera. So thank you for your story.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thank you.
Well, I think that's it. I want to thank all the panelists, Dave and Rob from FOVEA, and Kate and John at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. A lot of information was packed in there. This is recorded. It will be archived. We'd like to share it more, and hopefully more folks will take a look at it. So thanks to everyone.
Thanks for having us, Steve.
All right, and with that, let's sign off.
All right, bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.